Welcome to another episode of Churchill, the Finest Half Hour. I'm Richard Toye, and with me is the Rembrandt to my Leonardo, Dr. Warren Dockter. With us also is Tim Riley, Director and Curator of America's National Churchill Museum. And continuing the conversation that we had in our previous episode, I'd like to start, Tim, by asking you about key moments in Churchill's life. What, in terms of his painting life, how did this intersect with his career and his personal life?
I think there are a lot of moments in Churchill's life where painting came to his rescue, as we discussed last episode after the Dardanelles, of course, in 1915, when he picked up a brush for the first time. That was a seminal moment. But there are other times and periods. 1921 was an extraordinary year for Winston Churchill in many respects, personally and professionally. 1921, as Warren knows better than most, was the Cairo conference, where deciding what to do about the Middle East in the long aftermath of the First World War. Churchill was there for that, took his paintbrushes with him to Cairo, painted some extraordinary paintings of the pyramids. Also then traveled to Jerusalem and did an exceptional painting of the cityscape of Jerusalem. It's bathed in light. It's a really splendid painting, and it's on view right now in the Wallace collection, which is a must see in London. So 1921 was important for Churchill. It was also the year that he was invited to publish an essay about painting for the Strand magazine. Painting as a pastime was something that he was asked to do. In fact, there was a great correspondence between Winston and Clementine. She did not believe that Churchill was an authority on painting, and what could he have to say about Winston Churchill? And you're just there to snooker the £1,000 that he was going to be paid for the articles. And he wrote back by saying, "I think I in fact have something to say," and he did. But 1921 was when he was formulating his thoughts and writing about what he was doing in paint. And published. And it was also, of course, a tragic year for Churchill, personally. Both Churchill and his wife lost their daughter Marigold, and it was a great blow for the Churchill family. So I think painting again probably came to his rescue from a emotional standpoint as therapy. That was another great moment for Churchill 21. And we talked a little bit about, in the last episode, of the 1943 painting, the one painting that he did during the war of Marrakesh, the Koutoubia Mosque painting that Churchill gave to President Roosevelt. That was another seminal moment. Churchill used his painting as diplomacy. It was a soft power for Churchill. He often gave them as gifts to eminent statesmen like President Roosevelt, President Truman. There's a great painting that we have in the collection here at America's National Churchill Museum called Beach at Walmer, that after the war, Winston Churchill gave to Pug Ishmay. And the story goes that Ishmay was visiting Chartwell and said, "Winston, I'd like to have one of your pictures." And Winston said, "No, pick one out." Ishmay picked out this formidable canvas from 1938 of a family, bathing in the Kentish coastline with a Napoleonic era cannon planted on the beach. And he started to walk out with it. Churchill was reported to say, "Why don't you leave that here with me and I'll have it framed?" Ishmay knew Churchill well enough to know that if he had given the canvas back to them, he'd probably never see it again. So he said, "No, thank you, sir. I'll frame it myself." And off he went. And Ishmay ended up with one of the most remarkable paintings, and one of the few paintings that mixes politics with paint for Churchill. That 38 canvas was painted right around the time of the Munich crisis, and it's clear that by painting this Napoleonic era cannon, the Kentish coastline overlooking the Channel, Churchill is looking across, knowing that the looming threat of the Nazi invasion is coming. So that 38 canvas is also great moment. And occasionally those moments of politics and paint came together rarely, but occasionally in a powerful way.
I was going to say that he obviously did give a lot away, and not only to the famous statesman. There's a story in the playwright Joe Orton's diary where sort of a young man who'd been at the same villa that Churchill was staying at in the south of France, sort of Churchill gives him one, and he's kind of doesn't really think it's that great. And it's like, according to Joe Orton, sort of the guy threw it out of the train window on the way home. On closer inspection, that story turns out not to be true. He may have sort of disposed of it somehow, or didn't attach much importance to it. But sort of Joe Orton had sort of given it this sort of dramatist's really quite unlikely story of somebody actually chucking a picture out of the train window. But I mean, that kind of leads to my question, which is about, do we know, or how many Churchill paintings do we know that are extant, and how many are in private hands, and how many in museums?
We don't have an exact count. David Coombs is an extraordinary cataloger. After Churchill's death, was assigned the duty of cataloging all of the paintings at Chartwell, and his catalog is instrumental in anyone studying the Churchill archive and painting. Every painting has a number. It's called a Coombs number, almost like Mozart's numbers for his symphonies and all of his musical his positions. It's a C, so C301, C304, C405. The Coombs number. That catalog is extraordinary, and we estimate that Churchill painted over 500 canvases in his lifetime. We know where many of them are. The majority, not majority, but the single largest depository is at Chartwell to this day. But Churchill gave paintings away to family members. After Churchill's death, many of the family inherited Churchill's paintings. The children and grandchildren were invited to pick their favorites, and they ended up in family collections. And over the decade, were then either retained by the family or occasionally sold and introduced into the marketplace. A number of museums have Churchill paintings. Here in the United States, America's National Churchill Museum has several. Dallas Museum of Art has a couple. The Tate Gallery in London has a few. The Royal Academy, of course, has a famous painting that Churchill gave as a Royal Academician Extraordinary, his diploma work that was given to that gallery. So, Churchill has found his way into prominent collections and museums, but also private collections over the years. But there's a lot left to do. Paul Rafferty, a great artist and scholar, has really done some extraordinary work in the last few years of trying to track down Churchill's paintings and also identify the exact spot where Churchill painted. There's a lot more of art historical work to be done on Churchill. It's a growth market, to be sure, to get to the bottom of the subject, and that's one of my favorite quotes by Winston Churchill. He said, "When I get to heaven, I mean to spend the first million years painting, so to get to the bottom of the subject."
Yeah.
And I think we're still getting to the bottom of the subject when it comes to Churchill's paintings, for sure.
Just going back to that piece in the Wallace collection, and we talked a little bit about it in the last episode, and you were talking about his relationship, how he uses light, and I think that really comes across. And I know, being in Missouri and in America, you'll understand what I'm about to say. But one of the things I'm frequently asked to comment on or review books about is Churchill's relationship with religion. And of course, if you read his writings, you'll know that he was an atheist and at best, perhaps agnostic. He acknowledged some sort of idea of provenance, whatever that is, not provenance, but providence. And I think one of the interesting things that really comes across to me in that painting about Jerusalem is that Jerusalem and the way the light works in Jerusalem, almost like a halo around the city, but it's still very distant. And of course, Jerusalem is the arc center of all Abrahamic religions, whether it's Islam, Christianity, or Judaism. And there's no way for me to separate that painting from Churchill's own view of religion, the Abrahamic religions. And also, it reminds me of a quote that he famously said about the Anglican Church, or the Church of England, which was that he liked to support the church, but from the outside, like a flying buttress. Yeah. And there's a feeling to me, and that may be apocryphal, Richard. I saw you smile. I don't know. Richard Langworth isn't here to correct me, but I get a feeling in that painting that this sort of place is still quite distant from him. I mean, the city's far away in the painting. And I just have always thought that's a real interesting thing. And I wonder if you had any thoughts on that. I mean, I sort of talked about that in the Wallace collection thing, but I just wonder what you think.
I think when it comes to spirituality, and I'll use that word instead of organized religion, I think painting was very spiritual for Churchill. I think that the act of painting the act of communing with nature, if I can use that term, being outside and observing the world and the process of interpreting what he sees and dimensions all around him, putting in a two-dimensional canvas and conveying a stress was his own religion, if you will, more than any organized religion. And I think that for Churchill, and he writes about this in Painting as a Pastime, it was deeply personal and intimate experience, was almost a spiritual. And this is not exclusive to Churchill. A lot of visual artists have said this over the years, that the act of painting is a transcendent experience, and I think for Churchill it was. So I tend to go, as opposed to putting any key moment or linking to an organized religion for Winston Churchill. I believe painting was more of a spiritual act, if you will, but it also informed him in so many other areas of life. The contrast we see when light and shadow or reflection, on bodies of water, whether it's a rippled reflection, almost like the Impressionists of, these blues and greens and red reflected water, or trees, or a storm coming in, these dark gray clouds contrasting with a bright, blue sky. Those contrasts for Winston Churchill were the same kind of contrast he used to such great effect in his speeches with writing. He painted with words all the time. We know that. And his great speeches are great examples. But it's the same brain, after all, that is imagining these canvases. And he's experimenting with that. And I think really that's the biggest takeaway for me with Winston Churchill, in that you're seeing this incredibly creative mind at work experimenting. He did it all the time with his speeches and his words. He was much more accomplished as an orator or a writer than he was with canvas, but it was the same brain working to work to sort things out. And I think it's the same brain that also allows Churchill to see the world landscape and the geopolitical landscape. And I think it's fascinating to me that, just as on a canvas, he might put a little cloud over here, a touch of blue over there, or a touch of yellow there to create a contrast or a highlight so that the eye darts to one part of the canvas. It's the same brain that allows Churchill to say, maybe we need a little alliance here, or a little nudge there, or some forceful diplomacy there, or some reinforcements in a battle over there. It's the same, again, mind at work that sorts out these military or geopolitical situations that he uses the canvas. And if you look at Churchill that way, I think you get a glimpse and insight to the man that is, I think, very useful in our understanding of him and his qualities of being in leadership.
Yeah, I mean, he's very clear that he likes bright colors, and obviously you can see that in the paintings. So he says, cannot pretend to feel impartial about the colors. I rejoice with the brilliant ones, and am genuinely sorry for the poor browns.
I know. It's one of my favorites.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, I remember once when he was stationed in India as a young man, he asked for money to decorate his bungalow with, and he wanted wallpaper that was brown and pink. And I've always thought that was so odd.
Well, I think we have to look up the timing. Those were his racing colors.
Hey, I didn't know that.
That's probably has something to do with that too.
Absolutely. It didn't even occur to me. Thanks, Ted.
The one exception to the poor browns.
So, guess kind of another dimension is that Churchill made this part of his image. I mean, I'm not saying there's sort of, you can say that how conscious was that? It wasn't necessarily something that was a carefully calculated plan. Yet, I mean, particularly, I would say in the post-war years, he goes on holiday quite a lot, and he goes out in public. And lots of the newsreels have these little clips of him at a distance. He doesn't let people get too close. But, the long lenses of the day are trained on him doing his painting. So he's obviously also presenting himself, and obviously is an accomplished literary person. So I just wonder what you can say about the role that painting played in Churchill's public image. Perhaps, again, starting with that essay, which eventually is published as a very slim book, that kind of sort of announces to the public that Churchill has got something to say about painting.
Yeah, I think the post-war era is when Churchill is more widely recognized as a painter. The Painting of the Pastime is published in book form in 1948. Interestingly enough, it was published in the United States, and one gentleman who purchased it rather quickly, probably a first edition, was J.C. Hall of Kansas City, the founder of Hallmark Cards. And J.C. Hall was a Missourian at the time, so we like to talk about him here. And Fulton, he attended the Iron Curtain speech and made a deal with Winston Churchill to reproduce some of his paintings as greeting cards for Hallmark, Christmas cards at first, some of his paintings with snow scenes. And they were very, very popular sellers. And I think Churchill began to realize that there was interest in his daubs, as he called them, commercially. And of course, he worked out a deal so that he benefited financially from the sale of these reproductions and cards. However, exhibitions for Churchill were something that he didn't seem to have any interest in. In 1955, he was asked by the Royal Academy in London to do an exhibition of Churchill's paintings, and he was quite specific, writing to the director of the Academy at the time, saying, "There shall be no exhibitions of my paintings in my lifetime. Sincerely, Winston Churchill." He was emphatic this was not going to happen. He loosened up only after J.C. Hall of Kansas City and President Eisenhower actually cajoled Winston Churchill to organize an exhibition of Churchill's paintings in North America. And it actually opened in Kansas City in 1957-58. And that North American tour introduced the public at large to Churchill. And I think it was only then that Churchill began to see the power of his artwork on a larger world. It wasn't just a personal thing for him. It became something greater. And that led to the Royal Academy exhibition in London and really launched him as a painter. However, I think even to this day, his painting ranked rather low on his lists of accomplishments. He's known for so many things, Nobel Prize, world leader, statesman, and so forth. I think people are still somewhat surprised to learn that he's a painter. And I think the Wallace Collection exhibition in London right now is an excellent example. The public is reacting in great ways. There are, queues out the door to get into the exhibition, and the critics are being introduced to Churchill, the painter, in ways that they've never been introduced to Churchill before. And I've seen this over the years when we've organized exhibitions, 7 or so here in North America, that people are surprised and learned. And I think Churchill's reputation as a painter would astonish him because he considered himself an amateur, but I think secretly it would also please him that so many were so interested in his work. So I'm not sure how much he used painting as a lever in his lifetime, like he did so many other things for his PR. But I think late in life and certainly afterwards, it's something for which he's becoming more widely known.
Okay, so we're going to take a break now, and when we come back, we're going to talk about Churchill submitting paintings anonymously and having them assessed without people knowing who he was.
Welcome back to Churchill, the Finest Half Hour. I'm Dr. Warren Dockter, and with me as ever is Professor Richard Toye, the Hieronymus Bosch to my Gary Larson. Joining us today is Timothy Riley, and he is an expert in Churchill paintings. And I really am interested. We've been continuing our conversation about Churchill as a painter. And one of the real intriguing things for me, yeah, it is. Yeah, I'm through. Okay. One of the things I'm really interested in, Tim, is the fact that we know Churchill actually did submit a few paintings under aliases to be considered. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
He did. And while it's true that he did not exhibit widely in his lifetime, save for his post-war career and post-parliamentary career after retirement as PM the second time, but as early as 1921, he exhibited in Paris at the Gallery Drouet, which is no longer there, but it was a lovely gallery. And Churchill was encouraged to submit a handful of paintings under pseudonym of Charles Morin, R-I-N. And we're told that those paintings sold out. Everyone sold. We don't know what prices they fetched in 1921, but they were suitably in demand and desirable, such that in Paris in 1921, these presumably post-impressionist styled paintings sold out, and that must have pleased Churchill. So I'm always on the lookout, and I think all of us are. If you see any paintings in a relative's attic or study that are signed by Charles Morin or attributed to Charles Morin, that you may well have a hidden Churchill. It'd be great to know what those paintings were. Perhaps the most famous painting, however, that he submitted was the winter scene at Chartwell, which was painted in the 1920s. It was submitted to an amateur art contest at Sunderland House, and he submitted under the pseudonym David Winter. It was a winter scene, so Churchill's often very clever. This was a pretty non-clever name, but he exhibited the painting in an amateur art competition. It was judged by Lord Devine, Oswald Burley, and Kenneth Clark, three titans of art criticism and galleries and dealers in the 20th century. And two of the three judges picked the David Winter painting, Churchill's painting, to be first prize. But I believe it was Lord Devine who said, no, we can't award that painting first prize. And Clark and Burley said, well, why? And he said, well, it's too good. It's obviously not by an amateur, and this is an amateur art composition. We can't do that. And then they revealed that in fact it was an amateur, and so they won. So Churchill won first prize as David Winter for this amateur art competition for this lovely little painting, which is on view at Chartwell mostly, but now it's part of the Wallace collection, and it shines off the wall. It's a small little painting, but it packs a big punch, and you can see why it was exhibited and was received such acclaim. So you're right. These pseudonyms. Churchill didn't put his name out there. He didn't take credit. Instead, he actually eschewed credit. He shied away from it and used other names, which is counterintuitive considering Churchill's penchant for being his own best PR man. Usually, he stepped away from it, which is unusual, but it worked for him splendidly in those cases.
Go ahead, Richard.
Okay. Well, I suppose I think this point about Churchill as an amateur is really important because, in a way, I think that was something that was valued. It's like now amateur has maybe got the connotation and it just means like not particularly good at it, whereas amateur could really have a sort of be of value in its own right. Indeed, that's something where the professionals shouldn't be mixing in, as you were saying. And I think that kind of part of the charm of the painting as pastime essay or book is the way actually that it's not trying to lay down the law about history or sort of show off knowledge. It is actually trying to encourage people to have a go themselves and to actually sort of give them confidence. And so from somebody who is often seen as, with some justification, as being very egotistical, this is actually showing him being able to put himself in other people's shoes and to understand how they might feel when looking at a blank canvas for the first time and sort of trying to pep them up to try it for themselves. And again, I kind of just love some of these quotations. Even the sentence, "just to paint is great fun," very simple sentence, but sort of conveys his passion. And you mentioned earlier that he says that painting a picture is like fighting a battle. And he says, if anything, it's more exciting than sort of fighting a battle successfully, but the principle is the same. It is the same kind of problem as unfolding a long, sustained, interlocked argument. So sort of the idea that sort of doing a painting is like a battle or a kind of argument is a fascinating way of helping people see a problem in a sort of a different light, and that it isn't necessarily that you know exactly what you're doing when you start out and that you're going to just put every blob of paint in exactly the right place, that you're engaged in a kind of process of trying to work a problem through.
Absolutely right. And I think that passage from painting as a pastime underscores that perfectly. There's another wonderful series of words from Churchill himself that are often overlooked but need to be studied if you're going to understand Churchill as a painter. And those are the speeches that he gave at the various summer banquets at the Royal Academy. Churchill in 1948 was honored by the Royal Academy as an honorary Royal Academician extraordinary, but even before that was involved. Even as First Lord of the Admiralty before Gallipoli, he was invited to these banquets and made toasts and talks from time to time about Churchill and painting and politics. And in 1927, Churchill addressed the Royal Academy banquet and made a speech about art and politics. And he compares some of those who are working in government to painters, and whether they're successful or non-successful, and whether or not their deeds, just like those who are exhibited at the Royal Academy, are judged and criticized. And it's another fascinating way that Churchill uses art and painting to comment on his political life and his everyday life. But I encourage everyone to look at those wonderful speeches that he made at the various Royal Academy banquets. They're preserved in the archives at the Royal Academy, which I had the privilege of looking at a couple of years ago. And David Cannadine has republished them in his book, The Statesman as Artist, which is a must-have if you're on your bookshelf for those who are interested in Winston Churchill as a painter.
I wonder, so in some of those talks, he mentions other painters and his views of other different types of painting. We know, for instance, from the essays that Barry Phipps has written, that Churchill at least comically sort of liked to pretend that he didn't like modern painting, that he didn't like modernist sort of mid-20th century painting, even though we know that he had ongoing conversations with modernist painters about the style, which I've always thought, is a part of the wonderful contradictions.
I think Churchill's view of other artists, he clearly admired the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists, but his criticisms of contemporary art were vivid. And he did not care for a lot of the 20th century modernists, the Cubist styles, and so forth. The famous portrait of Churchill painted by Graham Sutherland and given to Churchill on his 80th birthday. It was a joint gift from both houses of Parliament and presented to Churchill famously. It was unveiled in Parliament, and Churchill was there to receive this as an 80th birthday. And as the canvas was unveiled, it showed and depicted Churchill, this old man. He was 80 years or older. He looked older in the portrait. Rather, almost a dumpy-looking portrait, not a heroic figure at all. And Churchill realized the eyes of the world were on him and the newsreel cameras were rolling. And he looked up at the painting, which he clearly did not like, and said, "This is a wonderful example of modern art." And everyone was heard chuckling in the gallery. And we know now that painting was really never displayed. It was taken back to Chartwell, and one of Clementine's secretary was actually asked to burn the painting, so it never did survive or see the light of day. So Churchill could be critical for sure of artwork that he did not like, and poor Sutherland was a victim of that, which is interesting because Churchill sat for that painting with Sutherland and they got along well. They talked about painting. It was only the final product that Churchill did not approve of. So Churchill did get along with artists and could talk shop with them, if you will. But he was not always critical of the final, sometimes critical of the final product.
You could see how they got on because the artist proofs are actually Churchill College, Cambridge, and they're remarkably striking. They're not as, I'm going to say, modernist in quotation marks. And you could see that Churchill was probably liking what he was seeing on the proof side of things as Graham Sutherland was putting it together. One of the interesting components of that story about whether, who may have destroyed that painting, I don't think Churchill himself would have done that out of respect for another artist, but I could imagine it bothering him so much that maybe Clementine or one of her people did. But an interesting side story about this is, as a component in some of the work that Christopher Andrews done around intelligence work, the Americans and the British had sort of gotten together and they wanted to use American and British art, of course, to sort of demonstrate to Europe. So they were putting together a kind of modernist, I'm going to say Anglo-American show. And they had invited Graham Sutherland to be a part of this. And they specifically wanted this painting. And so repeatedly, people from, I'm going to say, the civil service in Britain, as well as at the behest of American people in the CIA, were saying, hey, we would like to show this piece of art. And they were sending these letters to Clementine. And at first it's like, oh, we don't want it displayed. Oh, we can't find it. We think it's in the attic. It's just, there's an increasingly sort of silly responses about where this painting's gone. And then it's like, we don't want to share it. Thanks anyway. And I think it's an interesting story for two reasons. One, the sort of silly fact that she keeps saying, like, putting off Graham Sutherland. And the second one is that, from the sort of intelligence world, that they're like, oh, we can use this to show the rest of Europe how we're doing art now, to counteract, how the Russians and the kind of Soviet side looks at art, which is, I guess, diametrically opposed. Anyway, it's an interesting kind of a story, and I just wanted to share that part of it with you.
It is, and I believe there are others working on a novel or a book or a history of the Sutherland story, and I'm looking forward to seeing that come out. I mean, there are studies and sketches for the Sutherland portrait that exist, and there's a study in the National Gallery in London, portrait gallery, I believe, and there's some sketches at the Beaverbrook Gallery in Canada as well. So while the final product was destroyed, we do have a lot of sketches and studies for it. And there's more work to be done on that story too by art historians for sure. And I think it's work that keeps us all engaged, and it's job security for those of us who work in this field. That's for sure.
Well, I like to think of Clementine Churchill burning the portrait as her staging art happening, which kind of probably made the painting much more famous than it would otherwise have been. Tim, it's been great to have you on the pod. We hope to have you back again, maybe to talk about more paintings of Churchill. I'd actually just like to close with a quotation from Churchill's 1947 short story, The Dream, which is set in his painting studio and starts with him doing a copy of a portrait of his father, Lord Randolph Churchill. And then the ghost of Lord Randolph appears to him, and they have this long conversation in which Lord Randolph fails to realize that Winston has actually become a very successful politician, and there's sort of a lot of irony there. The sort of then at the end, his father kind of vanishes again into the ether, and Churchill writes at the conclusion of the story, he gave me a benignant smile. He then took the match to light his cigarette and struck it. There was a tiny flash. He vanished. The chair was empty. The illusion had passed. I rubbed my brush again in my paint and turned to finish the moustache. But so vivid had my fancy been that I felt too tired to go on. Also, my cigar had gone out, and the ash had fallen among all the paints.